So I made decisions in January, in the first month I was in office, to make budget cuts that were very unpopular. It really brought a lot of negatives to my reputation, but for purposes of the city economics, by spreading those cuts over 12 months, I actually...
You helped Dan Sullivan.
Tremendously. And that was not about me or Dan Sullivan. That was entirely about how do we keep Anchorage as strong as possible. I was the Assembly chair. To take me out of the Assembly chair, there would have had to have been a majority vote of the Assembly to change that. In the end, there was never any change, and so then I became acting mayor.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Alaska State Senator Matt Claman. He first laid eyes on Alaska while working as a cook for a mining company during the summer before his senior year of college. After law school, he made his way back to Alaska, settling in Anchorage. In the mid-2000s, he was elected to the Anchorage Assembly and was elevated to chair at the start of his second year. This meant that when Anchorage Mayor Mark Begich was elected U.S. Senator, Matt Claman, as the Assembly chair, assumed the role of acting mayor. This happened just after the 2008 fiscal crisis. Mayor Claman was forced to make difficult decisions that hurt him politically, but that he stands by today. In 2014, he was elected to the Alaska State House representing West Anchorage, and in 2022, he was elected to the State Senate, where he serves as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Matt Claman, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
I know you grew up in Dallas, but where were you born?
Boston.
Boston. How old were you when you moved to Dallas?
I believe I was 3. I don't remember it specifically.
Do you have any memories from Boston?
I do, but because I've been back to Boston many times. My daughter now lives in Boston.
What did your parents do?
My father was a child psychiatrist and my mother was an architect.
And why did they move to Dallas?
My father got a job to run a clinic in Dallas. He had just finished his residency in Boston.
Were they both originally from the East Coast?
Yes.
Massachusetts people?
My mother's from a long-time Massachusetts family, the roots before the Revolution. And my father's a Jewish immigrant family from New York.
Did you grow up Jewish at all?
We grew up Unitarian. Mm-hmm. My father, I think, when he married my mother, he found the Unitarian Church more connected to his values. And so we certainly had a certain amount of Jewish culture, but in terms of going to a temple, that was never anything we did.
Mm. And your mom, did she grow up?
She grew up Unitarian?
She did. So
she was I think I'm a third-generation Unitarian.
Oh, and I think that church was born in Massachusetts. I think that's...
Largely, yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you had siblings?
Oh, an older brother and a younger sister.
What was growing up in Dallas like?
We had a very close family that did lots of fun things together. That was the 1960s and 1970s. Dallas was still a very segregated place. Mm-hmm. And so you saw evidence of that whole dynamic that was evolving over time in Dallas. And
you were super young, but you lived there when President Kennedy was assassinated.
Yes.
Do you remember that at all?
I don't. I remember stories about it.
So having a dad who's a child psychiatrist, did he psychoanalyze you?
To the extent that he ever analyzed us, I was never aware of it. I think there was a point in time he was doing some professional training and there were some kind of group sessions. And at some point, I think he was interested in having the family come and participate in this kind of group talk about your family. And I remember in that particular place and time, all 3 kids went with him, but my mother declined to participate.
Did your dad's family come to America? I assume they came prior to World War II.
Oh, my father's side of the family came in the late 1800s.
Okay. Gotcha. Just so there was no family in the Holocaust that you know of?
Not that I know of.
Mm-hmm. So then you graduated from high school in Dallas, and did you identify as a Texan? And I ask this as somebody who doesn't identify as a Texan who grew up in Texas and was born in Texas.
I think in ways I identified as being from Texas, and in ways I didn't. I mean, there were a long time when I tended to wear cowboy boots a lot, including in the early days of my legal career. I would wear cowboy boots with my suits, and that was a certain brand that I was interested in having.
So You graduated from high school in Dallas, and then you went to Colorado College.
Correct.
And what did you study at college?
I was a history major.
Did you have a specific era of history that you focused on, or?
As a small liberal arts college, the history major had distribution requirements, and it was odd how they did it, but you had to take, for a history major, you had to take 2 classes in American history, 2 classes in European history, and 2 classes in what they described as third world history. But third world included Mexico and Russia and Asia. So the notion that this was the third world was a little bit odd, but they had that distribution requirement. And so you couldn't really specialize in anything.
Was there a particular aspect of history that you would consider yourself more interested in today?
I would say probably more American history than other parts of the world.
And then did you come to Alaska right after that? I know that I think in your Wikipedia, it says that you worked as a cook in a mining camp.
So I graduated from college in 1981, and then a few years later went to law school. But my first summer in Alaska was a summer during college in 1980. So I hadn't graduated from college, and I had a job as a field camp cook in a mining camp.
How did that come about?
Actually, friends from Anchorage, Sigrid Brody, the Brody family. Sigrid was one of my classmates at Colorado College, and she said, "Oh, yeah, I know some companies that do work in Alaska," and that's work she'd been doing for a number of summers before then. And she gave me a list of 8 companies, and I wrote letters to all 8 of them, and one wrote back and said, "We might have something for you." And I interviewed, and they hired me and sent me a plane ticket a month and a half later, and I came to Alaska.
Was it a good experience?
It was a great experience. We were all over the state. We were in the Birch Creek Hills outside Fairbanks. We were at a place near Healy. We were in McGrath for a couple of weeks, and then spent the last month based down at Ketchikan. But that included a drive with company vehicle and another one of the employees. We drove from Anchorage down to Haines and put the car on the ferry and took the ferry down to Ketchikan, and it was all part of the job.
So you went back for your last year of college after that.
Correct.
Did you know, I'm going to move back to Alaska at some point?
I think, yeah, after that, it always became a dream to come back and see. The big question was, how would winters go? Because if winters went well, then it would be home. And if winters were challenging, then it wouldn't be home.
What did you do before law school, like in that little brief period?
I was working different jobs. So I was out of college for 3 years before I started law school. I worked some in construction. I worked some in the cooking world. And I actually came back to Alaska again in 1982 to work for a different mining camp.
Okay. What made you want to be a lawyer?
I think the law was interesting both because interest in process, interest in how government functioned and the way the government things worked. And at some level, I thought going to law school would be a way to advance my career and have the kind of background and experience that would open opportunities for me that I wouldn't have if I just had a bachelor's degree with a history major.
Whenever people talk about lawyers in the legislature, you come up because everyone always says, "Oh, Matt Claman's super interesting because he was a prosecutor and a public defender." And how unusual is that to have done both sides?
It actually isn't that unusual. I would say what you see a little bit more often is folks who might start doing prosecution, and then when they go into private practice, they start doing criminal defense. So the blend that I have, which is some public criminal defense for the public defender and also private criminal defense, that may not be quite as common, but I can think of just a couple off the top of my head. Brent Cole, both folks that now do private criminal defense. They both were prosecutors during the day when I was working as a public defender. I actually tried cases against both of them, and both of them now are doing private criminal defense, but neither of them worked for the public defender agency.
Did you start off as a prosecutor and then
I started as a public defender.
You started as a public defender. Why did you become a prosecutor?
So my biggest part in prosecution was when I was acting mayor and involved in prosecution decisions, and a number of cases came with, as mayor, this is what we think we should do, and I had to make those decisions. But I was also the first mayor, and maybe the only mayor in Anchorage history to actually try a case as mayor for the municipality.
I want to get there, but so basically you were primarily a public defender for 20 years?
No, not even close. I was a public defender for about 3 years.
Okay, and then you went to private.
And then I went into private practice.
Okay. So you're a public defender for 3 years, and then you did private practice defense.
Private practice, civil and criminal.
Okay.
a whole range of different cases.
Until you ran for the assembly. So that's was a pretty big period of time.
Yes, but I was continuing to practice law while on the assembly.
Gotcha.
In fact, was continuing to practice law during the time I've been in the legislature and continuing to practice law today, now as in-house counsel to a small company. But essentially, from the time I became a member of the Alaska Bar, I don't think there's been time I haven't been practicing law.
Talk about why you decided to do the type of law that you decided to do.
More than anything else, I was really interested in doing trial work, going to court and presenting cases to judges and to juries and trying cases. And that actually, even though I haven't had a trial in several years, I still find the notion of going to trial and having trials and dealing with those issues very motivating, and it's interesting and challenging work.
Did you have any particular cases over the years that made a deep impression on you that you think changed the way you thought about law?
I'm not sure that I had cases that changed the way I thought about things. I've had a number of very memorable cases, and some are some of the unexpected places. So one of the things I did a lot of volunteer work, or so-called pro bono work, as we say in the law, was representing victims of domestic violence. It was a volunteer program they still do with the Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. And so I signed up to start taking some of those cases. And in general terms of the practice I've had, and it's been incredibly diverse. I've had criminal prosecution for criminal defense, civil plaintiffs, civil defense, done a number of appellate matters, and family law. And many people find family law the least interesting, and I generally found that to be true, that divorce and custody were incredibly challenging, incredibly hard on the parties, very hard on the lawyers representing them, because when you've got a personal injury case where they're on the defense of the prosecution, you weigh the strengths and weaknesses of the case, and you try to make a fairly rational decision about what will happen if you go to trial. But in divorce matters, there's so many emotions laid in with what are at some level financial decisions that it just is incredibly challenging. And one of the most memorable cases I have was a woman that had a long history of substance abuse, and she had a number of illnesses related to the history of substance abuse, but she was also the victim of horrific domestic violence. So when she was getting divorced, she got appointed to me to represent her in that case. And it was just a super challenging case because her still husband, more than 10 or 12 years later, had a repeated history of assaulting her and ending up in jail for domestic violence. And they'd never gotten divorced. And she came to me about, I'd say 2 months before her divorce trial was scheduled. And she came in and she said, "Oh yeah, when there was this paper I got from the court back on this old case involving my husband." And I said, "What's that?" And so she handed me this paper. And it was a appellate opinion from the Alaska Court of Appeals involving her husband. And the case described the physical abuse on her daughter, his stepdaughter, and the physical injuries. They had an ophthalmologist that testified that an 11-year-old girl had eyes that looked like a 55-year-old woman as a result of the hitting he had done to her head. And he had been found to be a worst offender. And when we went to the trial, that became part of the evidence, the history of his abuse. And when the case was over and the judge had finalized the divorce and said all was done, we walked out of the courtroom. And she looked at me and said, "What now?" And I realized that for this woman who had been in this beyond comprehension, horrific relationship, that she actually didn't even know what the future looked like without that burden on her. And I realized that in that particular case, I had opened a door for her that she had never even imagined was possible. And that's still one of my most memorable cases, even though it's in a divorce and custody matter, which was never my favorite kind of law to practice, but it was the impact that I could see that I'd had on one person's life was beyond anything I had ever imagined when I went to school.
How did you answer that question when she said, "What now?"
I said, "You're free. You can do what you want to do." And you could see in her eyes, and she cried, you could see that she finally realized that she had options that didn't involve having to go back to him.
How did you meet your wife?
We met through mutual friends.
In Alaska?
No, actually in San Francisco.
How long have y'all been together?
We've now been married for 35 years.
And you guys have 2 kids
2 kids
that you raised in Anchorage.
in Anchorage, yes.
Were there other lawyers in your family, or was your family surprised that you were going into law?
My uncle was a lawyer in New York City. And my grandfather always thought I should become a lawyer. And one of his funny stories, because they later in life moved to Dallas so that we saw them regularly in my youth. And sometime in my 20s, my grandfather took me out to lunch because these were these discussions when he'd want to talk family things and talk politics. And he says, I want to make an offer to you. If you go to law school, and this is in the early 1980s, he says, if you'll go to law school, I'll pay you $10 a month to go to law school. And he's a pre-Depression era businessman, and
So he thinks he's making an offer that's really great.
he absolutely, he totally thinks this is a great deal. And I said to him, Grandpa, that's a really generous proposal, but the economic reality is that $10 a month, might pay for, in the 1980s, might pay for a couple of meals or maybe a 12-pack of beer to get you through the month on Friday evenings, but $10 a month really wasn't going to make much difference. And I'm not sure he fully acknowledged that in the discussion, but I did start law school before he died, and he was very pleased.
Had people in your family been involved in politics?
No, not in my immediate family. My uncle, who was a lawyer, his wife was very involved in Republican politics in New Jersey for many years. But because we were in Texas, I didn't really see much of that.
What were your family Democrats, or
They were.
yeah? And then what inspired you to run for the Anchorage Assembly? And I guess you probably made the decision in 2006.
I ran in 2005 for the Assembly, and that actually, I'm sure, started because of the whole financial reporting cycles. I'm sure that started in the fall of 2004. I ran against then Assembly member Dan Sullivan, who was up for his 3rd term, so I ran against Dan Sullivan in 2005 for the Assembly and lost. And then 2 years later, when the seat became open, not because Sullivan, but because the then incumbent was not running for re-election, then I ran for the Assembly in 2007 and won.
Besides that initial motivation, just not being happy with the representation of Dan Sullivan, where did the idea come from? And did your wife support you? Was this something like, oh, you should do this? Or
I had been very interested in kind of government functioning. I'd been involved in different campaigns. I've been involved with the Knowles campaign for governor. My early volunteering for campaigns started back in 1982 when one of my college professors, Tom Cronin, was running for the U.S. House from Colorado Springs. And after the summer I worked in Alaska, I went back and volunteered on his campaign. In the 1984 presidential campaign, I volunteered for the Gary Hart campaign. So I've been volunteered for political campaigns and volunteered on different nonprofits in Anchorage. And getting involved in public policy was something that had interested me, I think, even before I went to law school. In fact, obviously, because I've been volunteering for campaigns before I went to law school. And so it was an area of interest, and I would periodically think maybe one day I'll run. And then in terms of time and opportunity, it seemed like a good time to run in 2005.
Gary Hart famously had an affair. It tanked his campaign. I think a lot of people think that if the exact same scandal were happening today, that he probably wouldn't have dropped out, that it probably wouldn't have been a big deal. But I'm wondering, as a young person working on his campaign, what were your feelings about the way that campaign imploded?
Well, it's interesting because there were a couple of different times with Gary Hart's campaign. The issues involving his extramarital affairs really arose in a later campaign. The
1988.
The 1984 campaign.
Gotcha.
He was this young candidate who was well-liked, but that was when Walter Mondale won the nomination.
Right.
And Hart then was seen as a very promising young candidate.
For the next election.
He was a Colorado senator, so I got connected with him through my connections in Colorado, having been a Colorado college student. But those issues with Gary Hart
came up later.
Came up in a later campaign. And that would have been the 1988 campaign.
Right.
That was a time in which I was winding down law school, getting ready to clerk for the federal court, and so I was less involved in political volunteering.
So you served on the Anchorage Assembly. It's like your first foray into elected office. I guess, were there any experiences, particular memorable things about being on the assembly or things that were interesting or surprising for you?
The biggest part that became really apparent was that, as here in Juneau, that we really have to work to build relationships and meaningful relationships amongst other legislators.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really apparent on the assembly. That was before they expanded the size of the
So it was
assembly.
11.
So we had 11 on the assembly, but when I was on the assembly, the first year, it was a more conservative assembly. And then the second year, we won 2 or 3 more progressive seats. And we went from a more conservative majority to a more progressive majority. And in working on that, it really became apparent that the relationships that folks had built on both sides of the aisle made a big difference. And so I was elected chair of the assembly at the beginning of my second year on the assembly, which historically my sense at the time was it was fairly unusual for a second year assembly person to become the chair. And that was largely a function of the relationships I built on both sides of the aisle. That my willingness to work with the prior conservative majority, I think, helped get their support for my becoming the chair.
And you continue to practice law. And I think I've talked to other assembly members from eras prior to yours where they make a big point that they worked a full-time job and they did the assembly. A lot of the pushback you get from people who currently serve on the assembly is that it's simply not possible, that they are scheduled with meetings all the time and that they don't really get paid enough to have the assembly be their full-time job, but they're expected to do a full-time job for the assembly. Have you noticed that change since when you served on the assembly till now?
I can't say. I have heard some of the same reports that the assembly job has become more time-consuming. I mean, I sometimes joke that I served the shortest 3-year term on the assembly because 6 months of it I wasn't on the assembly. I was the acting mayor, and then I ran for re-election and lost that election, and so I haven't been as tied into exactly how things are going on the assembly than I was when I served.
You got appointed to mayor when Mark Begich was elected to the U.S. Senate. So you took over as mayor.
It's not actually an appointment. It's operation of city charter.
Okay.
Under the charter, if the mayor resigns or the mayor dies or something happens to the mayor, then the assembly chair becomes the acting mayor, which is exactly how Quinn Davidson.
She wasn't the chair. Felix Rivera was, but he turned it down. So that's why it confused me a little bit because they did something a little bit weird where he turned down that position and she became the acting mayor without having been the chair.
I'd have to go back and look. My memory was that there was a decision they made that she would become the acting mayor, and they made a change in the chair to time that her becoming chair with the time of the resignation. And so,
got it. So they made it work.
But they made it work.
Yeah.
She definitely, I think charter still worked.
But the chair becomes the mayor. But that's actually important. That's important because you weren't lobbying to become the acting mayor. It's just that you happened to be the chair at the time that happened.
There was actually there was a lot of discussion and a lot of commentary going on about who would become the acting mayor. Because there was some criticism that as the chair, there were some that felt that I shouldn't be the acting mayor because I might use my position as acting mayor to boost my effort to run to become the mayor at the end of the 6-month term. And so there was a lot of criticism, and I did not make a decision to actually run to try to keep the seat until after I had become acting mayor. But one of the interesting parts was the suggestion was that if I became the acting mayor, I would have all these advantages in running for mayor. And in fact, that theory turned out to be completely untrue.
Because you didn't run for mayor.
Well, I did run for mayor, and I finished 5th.
So it didn't help you at all.
It didn't help me at all. And one of the reasons it didn't help was because when I became acting mayor in 2009, it was at the height of the financial
it was
crisis. And so I made a number of decisions as acting mayor that I believed then, and I think history has proven me correct. They were the best decisions for the municipality, but they were very unpopular.
You had to cut $20 million from the budget or something like that.
Exactly.
And so you were unfairly blamed for the economic realities of what was happening in the city when you were the mayor.
Unfairly on one hand, but also fairly blamed for the budget cuts. Those were decisions. One of the budget reality that really struck me then, and is why I think historically has been supportive of those decisions was that under the city budget, because it's a little tighter window than we have in Juneau with state budget and some of the ways things take on over years. Under the city budget, if you want to make cuts, you need to make them early in the calendar year, because as the months go by, if you want to make, say, a $12 million cut, if you make it in January, that's $1 million a month. If you make that in July, which is when the new mayor would come in, those same cuts would be $2 million a month. So the cuts to services that would be visible to the public in the latter half of the year would be much more extreme than if you do them early and spread them out. And the mayor has the authority to do that later with confirmation of the assembly, but you can make the cuts without having the assembly vote on them. And so I made decisions in January, in the first month I was in office, to make budget cuts that were very unpopular. It really brought a lot of negatives to my reputation, but for purposes of the city economics, by spreading those cuts over 12 months,
You helped Dan Sullivan.
tremendously. And that was not about me or Dan Sullivan. That was entirely about how do we keep Anchorage as strong as possible. And the reviews subsequently have been very positive, but there was a lot of controversy going on about who would become the acting mayor. I was the assembly chair. To take me out of the assembly chair, there would have had to have been a majority vote of the assembly to change that. Although there was a lot of discussion, in the end, there was never any change. And so I became the acting mayor.
I have only run for office twice and I won. I don't know what it feels like to lose. You had lost the first time you ran for assembly against Dan Sullivan.
Right.
But I just imagine you're doing the best job that you can as acting mayor, and then to come in fifth. And for me, I would feel bad. Did you?
Of course I felt bad. I was very disappointed and sad, but at the time I thought it was important that the public have the option of the person that's doing the job to keep them there and build on that experience. I think looking back on it and looking at some of the other things that have gone on in Anchorage, including when Austin Quinn Davidson was acting mayor, looking back on it, I have several people have said that was a poor decision. You probably would have been more effective if you had not run for mayor, if you just focused on doing the work for the city for that 6-month period and then returned to the assembly. And I think that's a fair criticism.
You went back to being a lawyer, and your representative was Lindsay Holmes. She famously changed from being a Democrat to a Republican,
Right.
with a huge backlash, which laid the foundation for you to run for the House. I don't know if can you talk about what your calculation was around deciding to run for the House?
Lindsay was somebody she was a neighbor, a friend. I'd known her for many years. In the early days when she was first elected, it was a contested primary in the Democratic Party. And she had come to me and asked me if I'd support her, and I told her that I would support her. And so I'd been her supporter from the get-go. So when she switched parties, there was a deep dissatisfaction in the community. And my general perspective had always been that for our West Anchorage House seat, if she was the representative, I was supporting Lindsay because I'd worked with her and liked her and still like her. I think she's very bright and capable. And
so it didn't bother you that she switched to Republican?
No, I was disappointed, but I didn't run to prove her wrong. What I recognized was that there was a lot of dissatisfaction, and I thought there was a pretty good chance that she wouldn't run again. And if she ran again as a Republican, I wasn't sure she would do very well. And so I wasn't disillusioned with the political process. I wasn't saying I would never run for office again. But when that happened, I thought that's likely to be an open seat. I should start thinking about running. And several people came to me and said, we don't think Lindsay Holmes is going to run again, or if she does, she's going to have to run as a Republican. We'd like you to run. And so I thought about it. And so my decision to run in 2014 was really not a reaction to Lindsay switching parties. It was more that here was a position in which I had some recognition in the community from my assembly service, and I thought this was an opportunity to get back into politics.
Had Lindsay communicated with you about her decision to switch to Republican, or had you guys had conversations about that?
As I recall, she and I talked about it after she had made the decision, but I don't believe I talked with her before she made the decision.
Did you tell her that it was a bad decision?
I don't think I told her that. I think she was hearing things and could decide for herself.
And so you got elected to the House. You served 2 years in the minority, and then forever after you've been in the majority, regardless of which body you're in. Was there anything in particular that you learned to do or not to do from that brief little period in the minority?
It was the same things that I talked about on the Assembly. It's about developing relationships with people, finding common ground on areas in which we have shared interest, and finding ways to advocate for those interests in ways that make it easier for people to be supportive of the concerns. I often say one of the first legislative wins I had here in Juneau involved the WWAMI program. So there was a proposal in the spring of 2015. It was my first year in the legislature. And there was a proposal to cut funding for the WWAMI program, the medical school program that involves several Northwest states, including Wyoming and Alaska and Montana. And the idea was we'd cut funding for the WWAMI and figure something out. And I actually only learned about it because I was wandering, and I went up to the House Finance and heard the proposal to cut WWAMI. And I thought, this is crazy. And part of the reason I thought it was crazy is because we have a friend from Juneau, from my early days working as a lawyer in Alaska, who was actually in the WWAMI program at the time and exceptionally competent, and now in a gynecological oncology fellowship program at MD Anderson. And I thought, you can't get rid of a program like that that's your biggest source of physicians coming to Alaska and just say, we'll figure something out. You actually have to have a meaningful plan. But this was as one of the things in the House budget. And so this was the one issue that I decided to take up on the House minority as the thing I would speak about. And we had a whole strategy that we'd each have one amendment that we offered to fight the House budget. And I chose the WWAMI program. And so I got up and moved the amendment, and I talked about it for, 3 to 5 minutes, I suspect, not particularly long, but I made this whole speech. And as soon as I got done, there was an at ease. And Mike Chenault was the speaker. And on the at ease, every woman on the majority went to the front of the House chamber to talk to the speaker. And I don't know what they were saying, but what I later learned was that this was a whole group of people, including Shelley Hughes, now in the Senate with me, that were very unhappy with the proposal to cut the WWAMI program. And they actually wanted to vote for my amendment. And if they'd voted for my amendment, it would have been cut. And so apparently there were discussions, and the later discussion that came from one of the other folks from the House majority came to me a couple of days later, because when it came up for the vote, the majority voted with the finance co-chairs, and the amendment was defeated. But then there was efforts I did after that, working WWAMI students to start getting actively involved with calling legislators. And we got some different folks supporting the WWAMI program to really start advocating in the legislature and trying to highlight the problems. But a few days later, one of the majority members came to my office and said, I know you thought you lost that about WWAMI, but you're actually going to win, because most of the folks in the majority don't want to do it. We realize it's a mistake. We're going to fix it in the Senate. And I often say the first legislative success I had here in Juneau was actually advocating to protect the WWAMI program and keep it in place, and it's still in place today.
Thank you for that. When you got reelected, then you became part of the majority, and you became chair of House Judiciary,
Right.
And you've remained chair of House Judiciary since then.
Now Senate Judiciary.
Now Senate Judiciary. Yeah, correct. But you've been, in whichever body, you've been the chair of Judiciary. I guess as somebody who's brand new as the chair of House Judiciary, what advice would you offer as somebody who's done it for a long time?
The biggest, I don't know if it's advice, but an example I can give is the Bar Association for a period of years was very successful in getting U.S. Supreme Court justices to come to Alaska as the keynote speaker for the Bar Convention. And I was one of the last successes of it when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg came to Anchorage as the keynote speaker when I was president of the bar. But when Chief Justice Roberts came to Fairbanks a couple of years before that, he gave a very thoughtful keynote address. And the one thing I really took away from that was he said that the most common theme of cases that the U.S. Supreme Court accepts for certiorari to consider and issue opinions, the most common theme is the balance of powers between the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. That when you really look at what gets to the Supreme Court, he was saying that a large majority of their decisions really get down to the basic question about which of the three branches gets to make these calls and makes these decisions. And that's a kind of perspective about not just the federal Constitution, but also our Constitution here in Alaska that has really stayed with me. And so I would say in the kind of walking the dog in the evening or in my office and everybody's gone home or in the apartment before I get started in the morning, whatever, the thoughts I would think about more than anything else is what is this balance of power within a three-part system between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And a recognition that I think Justice Roberts talked about was the importance that all three branches need to be strong and healthy for democracy to function. Mm-hmm. And that's what I would say is it's not really my advice. I would say take Chief Justice Roberts' advice, which is think periodically about how do the three branches of government work and how can they work effectively, because their effectiveness is really the foundation of our democracy and our republic.
A couple of things I was going to ask, a couple of policy questions. In Wikipedia, there's only one piece of legislation that's mentioned, and who knows how your Wikipedia gets written and who does it. But it just said that you had found this loophole that was present all across the country about law enforcement officers being able to have sex with a sex worker or I guess a witness during their investigation, and that you were going to close the loophole. That's the only piece of legislation that's mentioned in your Wikipedia, and that you had a bill to fix it. But I assume the bill never made it across the finish line.
I'd have to go back and see what they're talking about on Wikipedia. That's a topic that has come up. And I believe part of what we learned in asking about it is the suggestion that police officers working in some kind of a somewhat undercover way were using their position as an officer to force people to have sex with them. We've consistently heard that it is illegal today in Alaska, and that any officer that was doing such a thing, there would be internal investigations and it wouldn't be tolerated. And I'm not quite sure where
Wikipedia got their information.
I remember some discussions about that, and I remember that what we learned was that the suggestion this was a problem, that there wasn't evidence to support that.
Gotcha.
That's a very lawyerly answer, but
no, I understand where you're coming from. This is something that's been related to me that you have said. I've never heard you say it, but that you would not entertain any new revenue measures such as taxes until the dividend was zero. That's the way it's been paraphrased. You know what Matt Claman says? He won't talk about taxes until we have a zero permanent fund dividend.
So that isn't what I have said. What I have taken a position in campaigns is that I don't support new taxes. That doesn't mean we shouldn't discuss new taxes and talk about the pros and cons and what that means. I think we should. I think it's an appropriate discussion. But I have taken a campaign position, and I did it again in the 2024 campaign. And I think I started taking that position at least as early as 2020. But again, I'd have to go back and look at the campaign literature, but I have taken a no new taxes position for several years. And it isn't because I think we shouldn't have taxes until we're not paying dividend. What I think is that we need to have this discussion. In the Wielechowski case, the Supreme Court, I think, fairly succinctly said that the dividend has to compete like every other state program for the resources available. And what that says, and I think that's consistent with our Constitution. Our Constitution does not create a dividend. Our Constitution says the legislature figures out what to do with the earnings from the permanent fund. And so the question about where we spend money says that no one program is necessarily more important than another program. And I think we need to have those discussions. I think we're having those discussions today. But I've never said that I think we should have no new revenue until we're not paying dividends. I think that's a question that we need to decide on. I think we need to decide that with the public fully engaged. And part of that, too, is, and again, this isn't my opinion, but the last 2-year chamber polls show in increasing numbers that when asked, the Alaska public, if asked, would they like to have a tax and use the tax revenue to pay bigger dividends, the public answer is no, we don't want new taxes. We'd prefer an affordable dividend, and we don't want taxes to go to pay for a larger dividend. And that presents to me the challenge for the legislature. What are our priorities? and what are the things that the public views as most essential, because government cannot and should not do it all. We have limited resources, and we have to choose what those priorities are.
You are 65, you're turning 66 this year,
Yes.
which by U.S. Congress standards is quite young. You have another 25 years of service ahead of you. But I'm just curious, if you're not planning on staying in office till you're 90, what are your big goals over the remainder of your legislative career?
My goal continues to be to make sure the community is engaged, make sure we're making sensible decisions on a whole range of issues. And I think another part in terms of my legislative work, and I think you've seen some of that, I have worked a lot in sometimes very complicated areas of legislation involving parties that have sometimes very adversarial relationships. And sometimes those adversarial relationships are tied in with very close working relationships, and they're in conflict about legislation. And I've been involved in a number of those measures, trying to find a place where parties that have a lot of differences can actually find common ground and move forward and support a legislative proposal that may not look exactly the way it was introduced, but get those folks to move forward to try to help things go well. And a lot of them are business related. And when I think about what do you want to continue to do in the legislature, it would be continue to try to work with folks that have different perspectives and see if we can find common ground to move forward. The example I give most often is the work I've done with car dealers and car manufacturers. They are completely, in the biological terms, they are symbiotic. The dealers need the manufacturers and the manufacturers need the dealers, but they have a lot of conflicts. Mm-hmm. And we've been able to work on different pieces of legislation. Occasionally, we haven't been able to get both sides on common ground. Last year was an example. We could never quite get the manufacturers on board with the legislation that involved how mechanics get paid for their time working on cars. But all the other manufacturers, dealers' bills, we were able to reach compromise and get support from both sides. And I've done that with another number of different groups and a number of different pieces of legislation that have been efforts at finding that common ground.
It's Alaska. We have to work in the political environment we're in. But I wonder if some of the talking points that you have today would surprise your 24-year-old self. A young Democrat working on Gary Hart campaign, for example.
I guess at some level the answer is no, because we are elected not to represent what I think. We're elected to represent the people who elect us. And I think from the very beginning, my interest was trying to figure out what are the values of the people that I'm offering to represent and now that I have been representing. And somebody asked me a similar question, how do you describe the job? Is this leadership or followership? And my answer was, I think it's 50-50. And that's a rough 50-50. But when I say that, I think if you take something like we talked about before, the details of a legislation involving auto dealers and auto manufacturers. Mm-hmm. Almost all of us drive cars. If you sat down with me and said, what are you doing with that bill, and walk me through step by step, most of the people in my community would say, you're doing a great job. I don't want to know the details. Just keep doing what you're doing. They want that leadership. They want digging into details, taking values that they support and working towards solutions that they would care about. And if I walked them through and spent an hour and a half telling them about the details, they would end up either sound asleep or saying, thank God you did it because I don't want to know the details. And then there are other things in which I need to be tuned into where my constituents are, because my job is to represent them and not to just come up with some idea where I'm providing leadership and saying, I'm giving you leadership. I'm here to represent you and represent the values you've reflected in votes on things like ballot measures to show where the community is. And I view the job as this combination of leadership and followership, because if I lose touch with the people I represent, then I think I'm no longer doing an effective job. And so I don't really think that's changed, because I think the effort in my early 20s when I actually went to law school, but interested in local government and national government, was a lot of that time was not so much spent talking about here's what I think we should do, about talking more about what is it that the public really want and how are they expressing that and how can you figure out what they're interested in. And sometimes that's pretty easy, but other things are not so easy.
Last question I ask everybody is if they have a book they'd like to recommend. Do you have a particular book that you would recommend?
A good book that I will recommend because I just finished it and I thought it was a great story and a very Alaska story. Written by Caroline Van Hemert, called The Sun is a Compass. And it's about her journey with her fairly new husband on this 4,000-mile journey from the northwest Washington all the way up the Inland Passage, across the mountains, up near Haines, and then eventually all the way up to the North Slope and around Kotzebue. It was about an 8-month journey, the two of them, before they started having kids and stuff. And it's a lovely story, both about an Alaska adventure, but it's also about the Earth today and climate issues. And she's got a lot of research in birds. So she talks a lot about birds and what she sees with the birds and how the birds are living in the same place where she and her husband are going. And it's also a love story and a reminder about how we build relationships and how we have to learn about the importance of taking one another as they come. And I just thought it was a marvelous personal story about a journey here.
What was the book called again?
The Sun is a Compass.
And it's by
Caroline Van Hemert.
Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-465-4940.